June 11, 1944. German troops watched the river, confident the Americans would be stuck for days. That's how war works. Until they heard it. Clang, clang, clang. A bridge being rebuilt in the dark, not by engineers alone, but by infantry, drivers, cooks, men who had learned to build bridges like they learned to fire rifles. Mortars hit. The hammering never stopped. At dawn, jeeps were already crossing. One German soldier whispered, "We destroyed a bridge last night, and they built a new one before sunrise." That's when the truth hit them. The Americans weren't advancing because they were brave. They were advancing because they were prepared. Because they had more steel than Germany had time.
June 11, 1944. Somewhere along the Vire River, lower Normandy, the air tasted of wet stone and cordite. Along a shattered bend in the Vire River, where water moved slow and brown beneath a sky the color of old gunmetal, German sentries watched through the early morning haze. Their breath came in short bursts, visible in the damp cold that never seemed to lift, even now in what should have been summer. Across the water, barely 200 meters distant, the Americans were building something. The sound reached the German positions first. Metal on metal, rhythmic and unceasing, like the heartbeat of some vast mechanical creature that had no concept of fear or exhaustion. Obergefreiter Klaus Mittler, positioned in a hastily reinforced farmhouse that overlooked the river crossing, adjusted his field glasses and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It wasn't fear exactly, it was bewilderment. The Americans had arrived at the riverbank less than 3 hours before dawn, and already steel girders were rising from the water like bones assembling themselves in reverse, defying not just the current, but the very logic of warfare as he understood it. The Wehrmacht had been retreating through Normandy for 5 days, not in the chaotic rout that would come later, but in the methodical, fighting withdrawal that German doctrine had perfected across 3 years of Eastern warfare. Every bridge destroyed, every roadway cratered, every river crossing fortified or denied. This was the arithmetic of defensive war. Make the enemy pay for every meter, slow his advance until reinforcements arrived or weather intervened or the Allied coalition fractured under the weight of its own logistics. The manuals were clear, the experience from Russia was clear. Destroy the bridge and the enemy stalls. Modern armies moved on roads and railways and pontoon spans. Without them, divisions became isolated, supply columns ground to a halt, and timetables, those sacred documents that governed all military planning, became meaningless. The Allies were supposed to need days, perhaps a week, to restore a major river crossing. That was the calculation. That was how war worked. But the Americans building that bridge in the pre-dawn darkness of June 11th were working from a different manual entirely. The German soldiers who watched them that morning had come of age in a military culture that prized endurance, discipline, and the hard-won expertise of specialists. In the Wehrmacht, engineer units were elite formations, trained for years in the precise mathematics of bridging, fortification, and demolition. Building a Bailey bridge or a pontoon span required surveying equipment, exact measurements, carefully sequenced construction phases. It was engineer work, technical, methodical, not something to be rushed. The German army had excellent engineers, men who could build a crossing under difficult conditions given time and the proper materials. But time was always required. Haste led to structural failure, to spans that buckled under the weight of armor, to catastrophic collapses that could cripple an entire corps. Yet across the Vire, in the gathering light, American soldiers were assembling a bridge with a speed that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of engineering itself. They worked in rotating shifts, teams moving in and out with choreographed precision, each man knowing his role without apparent need for shouted orders or officer supervision. The sound never stopped. Even when German mortars found the range and bracketed the construction site with explosions that sent geysers of river water skyward, the hammering continued. Men fell, were dragged aside, and new men took their places without missing more than a handful of beats. The steel sections, prefabricated, standardized, maddeningly identical, came forward on trucks that themselves seemed immune to the concept of delay. One truck departed, another arrived. The pile of bridge components never diminished, as if somewhere behind American lines existed a factory that did nothing but produce these interlocking steel panels, and it had been doing so for years, preparing for precisely this moment. Mittler lowered his field glasses and looked at his squad leader, Unteroffizier Schmidt, who had fought in France in 1940 and in Russia for 2 winters after that. Schmidt's face, weathered and deeply lined for a man not yet 30, showed something Mittler had never seen there before. Not the grim determination of defensive fighting, not the fatalistic acceptance that came with long odds. It was closer to incomprehension, as if Schmidt were watching a magic trick performed in broad daylight and could not identify the mechanism of deception. "They've been at it 3 hours," Mittler said quietly. Schmidt nodded, still watching the bridge take shape. "We blew that crossing 2 days ago, used the entire demolition inventory. The center span went into the river in pieces." He paused, working his jaw. "By doctrine, that should buy us 72 hours minimum. That's what the manuals say. Even the Americans can't build that fast." But the manuals, like so many German assumptions about this invasion, were being rewritten in real time by men who had apparently never read the original versions. The bridge rising from the Vire was a Bailey Bridge, a British design, though the Americans had adopted and mass-produced it with typical industrial fervor. It was not elegant. It had none of the architectural grace of the stone spans that had crossed European rivers for centuries. None of the careful craftsmanship that German engineers brought to military construction. It was, in its essence, a piece of industrial equipment, an assembly line product designed not for beauty but for a single purpose: to be built faster than the enemy could believe possible. Each panel weighed 570 pounds. Each section locked into the next with pins and bolts that required no specialized tools, no mathematical calculations, no surveying equipment. The design was brilliant in its simplicity, but the speed came not from the design alone. It came from something deeper, something that German military theory had failed to account for. In the German army, bridging was the domain of pionniers, engineer troops who trained for years in the specialized skills of military construction. Infantry divisions relied on these specialists, waited for them, scheduled operations around their arrival. An infantry regiment could not be expected to build its own crossings any more than it could manufacture its own artillery shells. Division of labor was the foundation of military efficiency. Each man had his role, his specialty, and stepping outside that role invited chaos. But the Americans building the bridge over the Vire were not specialists. They were not engineer troops in the German sense. Some were, certainly. The U.S. Army's engineer battalions were formidable units, trained and equipped for exactly this kind of work. But scattered among them, working the same tasks with the same competence, were riflemen from infantry companies, artillerymen whose guns were still being brought forward, even cooks and clerks and truck drivers who had been handed tools and shown once how the panels locked together. The American military had done something the Wehrmacht had never seriously contemplated. It had made bridge building a basic infantry skill, something taught in training camps across the United States to hundreds of thousands of men who would never officially be classified as engineers. Every American soldier understood the basic assembly of a Bailey Bridge the way every German soldier understood field fortification. It was democratized expertise, mass-produced competence, and it turned every rifle company into a potential engineer unit when the need arose. More than that, the Americans had industrialized the entire process with a thoroughness that seemed almost wasteful until you watched it unfold under fire. Behind that first bridge site on the Vire, battalion supply officers had stockpiled enough Bailey Bridge sections to build 3 complete spans. Not 1, 3. The American logistical doctrine assumed bridges would be damaged during construction, that sections would be lost to artillery fire or mishandled in the chaos of combat engineering. So they brought triple redundancy, quadruple redundancy, numbers that seemed excessive until the first mortar barrage landed and damaged panels were simply dragged aside and replaced without slowing the overall construction tempo. A German engineer unit working with carefully allocated materials would have been forced to pause and assess, to salvage and repair. The Americans just pulled fresh sections from the seemingly endless supply and kept building. By 0600 hours on June 11th, as full daylight spread across Normandy and German forward observers finally got clear views of the river crossing, the first Bailey Bridge was functionally complete. Not finished in the careful German sense, there would be hours of additional work, reinforcing and securing and inspecting. But complete enough that light vehicles were already crossing, and within another hour, Shermans would roll across that span at speeds that made the entire structure bounce and sway in ways that looked catastrophic, but were, according to American engineering calculations, perfectly acceptable. The bridge was rated to carry those stresses. It had been tested in Louisiana and Arizona and a dozen other training grounds. The Americans knew exactly how much punishment the design could sustain, and they pushed it to those limits without hesitation. Mittler watched the first jeeps cross and felt the strategic situation shifting beneath him like unstable ground during an artillery barrage. The German defensive plan for this sector had been predicated on time, on buying days for the 353rd Infantry Division to establish stronger positions further south, for the 2nd SS Panzer Division to complete its movement from the interior. Every destroyed bridge was supposed to be an hourglass, counting down the hours until German armor could counterattack. But the Americans were stealing those hours back, collapsing timetables, turning a campaign that should have unfolded over weeks into something that happened in days, in hours. "We need to destroy it," Mittler said. It wasn't a suggestion, just an observation of obvious necessity. Schmidt was already shaking his head. "Artillery's been falling short all morning. The ranging is off. Too many craters between here and there. The observers can't get accurate coordinates. We'd need direct fire, and we don't have anything heavier than the MG-42. He paused, watching a line of American supply trucks begin crossing the bridge in convoy. "And even if we drop it, how long do you think before they build another?" That was the question that German commanders across Normandy were beginning to ask themselves, and the answers they were receiving from forward units were all variations of the same impossible truth: hours. Give the Americans 6 hours, maybe 8, and they would replace any bridge you destroyed. They had the materials, they had the trained manpower, or rather, they had the mass-trained manpower, which amounted to the same thing. And they had something else, something harder to quantify in tactical reports, but increasingly obvious to every German soldier who encountered it. They had abundance. The bridges rising across Norman rivers in mid-June in 1944 were not just feats of engineering. They were expressions of industrial capacity so vast it bordered on the incomprehensible. Each Beatty Bridge required tons of precision-manufactured steel. The Americans were building dozens of them simultaneously, all across the invasion front. And behind each bridge stood supply chains that reached back across the Atlantic to factories in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, foundries that poured steel around the clock, welding shops that prefabricated panels by the thousands, shipyards that loaded this material onto Liberty ships that sailed in convoys so large they literally filled the horizon. A single Bailey Bridge represented thousands of man-hours of labor, but those hours had been spent months ago in industrial facilities that German bombers could not reach and U-boats could not reliably interdict. By the time the bridge sections arrived in Normandy, they were just cargo, abundant and replaceable. The German army, by contrast, was discovering the consequences of fighting a poor man's war with a rich man's enemy. Every piece of German bridging equipment was valuable, carefully tracked, allocated by high command. Loss reports mattered. Damaged sections were salvaged and repaired because replacements were not guaranteed. German engineer units could build effective bridges. They had done so across the rivers of Russia, but they did so with an economy of resources born from scarcity. The Americans built with the casual generosity of a nation that had more steel than it knew what to do with, more trucks than it could easily count, more of everything except patience. Feldwebel Horst Bauer, serving with the 352nd Infantry Division's Pioneer Battalion, encountered this disparity firsthand on June 13th, 2 days after the Vire crossing. His unit had been ordered to demolish a bridge over the Yor River and then, if possible, defend the crossing site to delay American engineers. They destroyed the bridge efficiently. German demolition expertise was world-class, refined through years of retreating warfare. The stone span collapsed into the river in a satisfying roar of ancient masonry. Bauer positioned his platoon in good defensive terrain, registered fields of fire, settled in to wait. The Americans would come eventually, and when they did, his men would make them pay for every meter of that riverbank. The Americans arrived at 1400 hours in a convoy so long Bauer couldn't see the end of it. They brought not one engineer company, but 3, supported by armor, artillery, and so much bridging material that they began building in 2 separate locations simultaneously, as if the demolition of one bridge had simply created a market for 2 new ones. Bauer's platoon engaged with machine gun and mortar fire. They inflicted casualties. The Americans took losses, men dropping on the exposed riverbank where there was no cover and the German firing positions were well concealed. But the construction never stopped. Not slowed, not paused. American medics dragged wounded men back while engineers moved forward. Smoke generators created concealing fog. Counter-battery fire suppressed German mortars with a weight of high explosive that Bauer, veteran of 2 years of Russian fighting, found genuinely shocking. The Americans could afford to expend more artillery ammunition on suppressing a single platoon than Bauer's entire battalion had been allocated for a week. By 1700 hours, 3 hours after the Americans arrived, the first vehicles were crossing on a completed Bailey span. Bauer withdrew before his position was flanked, which would have happened within the hour given the speed of American tactical movement once they had armor across the river. He filed a report with battalion headquarters that night, trying to explain what he had witnessed. The words felt inadequate. How did you convey, in the flat language of military reporting, that the enemy seemed to possess infinite resources? That destroying a bridge no longer bought time, but merely inconvenienced an opponent who could rebuild faster than you could retreat? The reports accumulated through mid-June, climbing up the German chain of command, each one variations on the same theme. Americans building bridges in 4 hours, in 6 hours, in one documented case in less than 3 hours under direct fire. Crossings that should have required a week completed before German reinforcements could arrive. By June 18th, 7 major bridges had been built across the rivers of Normandy by American engineers, and each one represented not just a tactical success, but a psychological revelation for German defenders. The Wehrmacht had entered this campaign with strategic assumptions inherited from 4 years of European warfare. That logistics limited operational tempo, that destroyed infrastructure bought time, that modern armies moved at speeds dictated by supply and engineering capabilities. The Americans were demolishing those assumptions as methodically as they demolished German defensive positions, replacing old truths with new realities at a pace that left German commanders struggling to adapt. In the German barracks and forward positions, among the ordinary soldiers who watched American bridges rise through the smoke and chaos of the Normandy campaign, a bitter joke began circulating. Destroy a bridge in the morning, they would say, and the Americans will have 2 built by evening. Like all good soldier humor, it contained a core of uncomfortable truth. The Americans were not just winning the tactical battle of river crossings. They were demonstrating a form of warfare that German military tradition had no framework to process. Warfare as mass production. Battles won not through superior fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, but through the systematic application of industrial abundance. The Bailey bridges became symbols of this disparity, but they were not the only ones. German soldiers in Normandy quickly noticed that American units seemed to operate with material assumptions that bordered on the profligate. Damaged vehicles were often abandoned rather than repaired, because bringing forward a replacement was easier than organizing field maintenance. Artillery units fired preparatory barrages that consumed more ammunition in an hour than a German battery might be allocated for an entire operation. When American positions were overrun, and sometimes they were, because industrial capacity does not guarantee tactical superiority, German soldiers found warehouses of supplies, stocks of food, equipment that suggested a military with no concept of scarcity. The food, especially, became a point of dark fascination. American rations were not just adequate, but abundant, varied, occasionally luxurious by Wehrmacht standards. Chocolate was common. Coffee was universal. Not the ersatz chicory brew that German soldiers had grown grimly accustomed to, but real coffee, in quantities that seemed to suggest the entire United States was swimming in it. Cigarettes came in packs, not carefully rationed individual sticks. When German soldiers overran an American supply depot near St. Lo in early July, they found crates of Coca-Cola, that strange sweet beverage that had somehow become synonymous with American identity. Men who had been subsisting on black bread and whatever they could scavenge from Norman farms stared at this abundance and felt something more profound than envy. They felt the gap between economies, the reality that they were fighting a nation that could afford to ship soda across an ocean while waging war on 3 continents. The bridges, though, remained the most visceral expression of this gap. They were visible, undeniable, impossible to rationalize away with propaganda about German technical superiority or fighting spirit. A bridge either stood or it didn't. The Americans built them again and again, under fire and under terrible conditions, with a speed that made a mockery of German defensive calculations. And they built them not through superhuman effort or reckless bravery, but through systematic preparation, through training that had made bridge construction a routine rather than a heroic feat, through supply chains that never seemed to run dry. Lieutenant Wolfgang Schneider, serving with the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, watched an American bridge go up across the Saloon River in late June and tried to articulate, in a letter that would never be sent, what the experience meant. "It is not that they are better soldiers," he wrote. "Man for man, in courage and skill, we are their equals or better. But they are not fighting as soldiers in the sense we understand. They fight as workers, as factory men, and they have brought their factories to the battlefield. When we destroy something, they simply manufacture a new one. They do not mourn the loss. They do not carefully husband resources. They build and build and build, and there is always more behind them. It is like trying to stop a river by removing water one bucket at a time. The river does not care. The river is endless." The letter remained in Schneider's pocket when he was killed 3 days later during a failed counterattack. An American graves registration unit eventually recovered it, along with his other personal effects, and filed it away in the vast bureaucratic machinery that processed such things. The letter would not be translated and studied until years after the war, but its observations were not unique. German officers across Normandy were reaching similar conclusions, filing similar reports, struggling to convey to higher headquarters that the American advantage was not primarily tactical or even technological. It was systemic. It was industrial. It was the advantage of a nation that had spent 2 years converting its entire economy into a war machine and was now deploying the products of that conversion with a thoroughness that made German rearmament look almost quaint by comparison. The strategic implications were profound, though German high command was slow to fully absorb them. If the Americans could replace bridges in hours, then defensive strategies predicated on terrain denial became much less effective. If they could sustain this pace of construction across an entire invasion front simultaneously, then the careful German timetables for reinforcement and counterattack were obsolete before they were drafted. The Normandy campaign had been expected to develop along certain predictable lines. Initial Allied gains, followed by a grinding positional struggle as supply lines lengthened and German reinforcements arrived. That was how modern warfare worked. That was how it had worked in Italy, in Russia, in North Africa. But the American bridges changed the calculus. They kept supply lines short. They maintained operational tempo.
They turned what should have been a weeks-long struggle to break out of the beachhead into a campaign measured in days. By early July, when American
forces finally captured Saint-Lô after brutal fighting, they did so supported by a network of bridges and supply routes that had been built, in many cases, under German observation and fire. The infrastructure of American advance was being constructed faster than German forces could destroy it, and that simple fact contained within it the seeds of operational collapse. On July 25th, when Operation Cobra began and American forces achieved the breakthrough that would lead to the encirclement of German armies at Falaise, the speed of the advance owed much to the bridges. Not the bridges alone. American tactical air power, artillery superiority, and the eventual collapse of German defensive cohesion all played roles. But the bridges were foundational. They were what allowed American armor to keep moving, supplies to keep flowing, infantry divisions to advance without pausing to establish elaborate river crossing operations. The Bailey Bridges of Normandy were not glamorous pieces of military equipment. They did not inspire the same awe as Shermans or P-47s or long-tom artillery pieces. But they were, in their unglamorous efficiency, perhaps more revolutionary than any weapon system deployed in the campaign. The German soldiers who survived Normandy and retreated into the interior of France carried with them lessons that would shape the remainder of the war. They had learned that American material superiority was not a propaganda exaggeration, but a tactical reality that affected every level of combat. They had learned that destroying enemy infrastructure no longer reliably bought time. They had learned that the American way of war was not necessarily more courageous or tactically sophisticated than their own, but it was more sustainable, more scalable, built on foundations of industrial capacity that could absorb losses and setbacks that would cripple a less wealthy military. But perhaps the most important lesson, the one that seeped into German strategic consciousness over the months and years that followed, was simpler and more demoralizing. They were fighting an enemy that could afford to be wasteful. The Americans could build 2 bridges where one would suffice. They could abandon damaged equipment rather than repair it. They could fire 5 artillery shells where 1 carefully aimed shot might work. They could do all of this not because they were reckless or undisciplined, but because they had so much material abundance that careful economy was less efficient than generous expenditure. This was warfare as mass production, and mass production followed different rules than the careful, resource-conscious approach that German necessity had imposed. In late August 1944, as the Falaise Cocket closed and the German army in France effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, engineers from the US First Army conducted an inventory of bridges built during the campaign. The numbers were striking. Across Normandy and into Brittany, American forces had constructed more than 200 major bridges in less than 3 months of campaigning. Some had been destroyed by German counterattacks or artillery and rebuilt. Some had been damaged and repaired. Some had been built, used briefly, then abandoned as the front moved forward. The cumulative tonnage of steel involved, the man-hours of labor, the sheer scale of coordinated logistical effort represented by those 200 bridges would have impressed any industrial planner even in peacetime. That it had been accomplished during active combat operations, often under fire, while simultaneously fighting one of history's most professional armies, bordered on the unprecedented. A German officer captured during the retreat, interviewed by American intelligence personnel, was asked what aspect of American military capability had most surprised him. He thought for a long moment, and then mentioned the bridges. Not the air power, though that had been devastating. Not the artillery, though that had been overwhelming. The bridges. You built them faster than we could believe, he said through a translator. We thought we understood the limits of military engineering. We thought we knew how long these things took. You showed us we were wrong. Everything we planned was based on assumptions about time, and you stole that time from us. We could not adapt fast enough. That phrase, "we could not adapt fast enough," captured something essential about the Normandy campaign and perhaps about the entire trajectory of the war in Western Europe.
The German army was not incompetent. It was not cowardly or tactically inept. In many engagements, German units fought with skill and determination that impressed even their opponents. But they were fighting a war that was increasingly defined not by tactical excellence, but by systemic capacity. And in that contest, they were hopelessly overmatched. The Americans were not necessarily better soldiers, but they were part of a better system, backed by an economy and industrial base that could turn warfare into a form of manufacturing, where bridges and bullets and battalions could be produced on scales that made individual losses almost meaningless. The symbolic weight of those bridges, rising from Norman rivers under German fire, would persist long after the campaign ended. They appeared in American military training materials as examples of combat engineering excellence. They showed up in British strategic analyses as proof that American logistical capabilities could overcome tactical challenges. They became, in a quieter way, part of the mythology of American military effectiveness. The idea that American soldiers were particularly good at the unglamorous, practical work of making war function, at building and fixing rather than just fighting. For the Germans who witnessed them, the bridges represented something more ambiguous. They were proof of an adversary who fought with resources that seemed limitless, who could absorb and replace losses that would be catastrophic to any European power. They were symbols of an American approach to warfare that was simultaneously impressive and somehow alien. Warfare conducted like a massive industrial project, where success was measured not in heroism or brilliant tactics, but in throughput and efficiency and the relentless accumulation of material advantage. On a quiet evening in September 1944, after the liberation of Paris and the headlong American advance toward Germany had finally slowed at the borders of the Reich itself, a Bailey Bridge still stood over the Vire River, where Oberstfreiter Klaus Mittler had first watched it rise 3 months earlier. Mittler was long gone by then, dead in the Falaise fighting, or captured or retreated into Germany. The records are unclear, and he was, in the end, just another name among millions. But the bridge remained, and it was still in use, carrying supplies forward to American units that were already hundreds of kilometers to the east. The structure looked tired, weathered by months of heavy traffic and Norman rain. The steel showed rust in places. The wooden decking had been replaced several times, but it held. It performed the function it had been designed for with the same unglamorous reliability that characterized so much American military equipment. It was not beautiful. It was not particularly innovative. The British had designed it after all. But it was there, solid and functional, still carrying the weight of an advancing army that had crossed the Seine and the Meuse and would, in time, cross the Rhine itself. If there was a broader truth to be drawn from those bridges of Normandy, it may be this. Wars between industrial powers are won not by the most courageous soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by the nations that can best sustain the machinery of conflict. Courage matters, tactics matter, but beneath them both lies the foundation of production and supply, the unglamorous mathematics of steel tonnage and shipping capacity and factory output. The Americans understood this in 1944 in ways that perhaps no military power before them had fully grasped. They built their strategy not around heroic effort, but around sustainable systems. They designed their equipment not for maximum performance, but for maximum reliability and replaceability. They trained their soldiers not to be specialists in every skill, but to be competent in enough skills that any unit could perform essential tasks without waiting for experts to arrive. The Germans, for all their tactical sophistication and fighting skill, had entered the war with a different philosophy. They believed in the superiority of the expert, the specialist, the carefully conserved resource. They built equipment that was often technically superior to American equivalents, but harder to manufacture and maintain. They organized their military around elite units and specialized troops. It was a philosophy born from a smaller economy, a less industrialized
society, a tradition that valued craftsmanship over mass production. And it worked for a while, when fighting opponents who were not vastly richer. But against the United States, with its continental resources and industrial capacity and cultural comfort with standardization and mass production, that philosophy encountered its limits. The bridges of Normandy were where those limits became visible, where German assumptions about the pace and nature of warfare met American realities and broke. They were not the most dramatic symbol of the campaign. That honor belongs to the beaches themselves, to the airborne drops, to the tank battles and the liberation of Paris. But they were perhaps the most honest symbol, the most revealing. They showed, in steel and sweat and methodical construction, what it meant to fight a war as an industrial democracy, to bring to bear not just courage or cleverness, but the accumulated capacity of a continent-sized economy that had committed itself fully to victory. And they showed something else, something that the German soldiers who watched them rise understood in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. That this was a war they could not win through fighting alone. You could not outfight an economy. You could not use tactics to defeat a supply chain that stretched across an ocean. You could not, in the end, stop men who would build a bridge in 4 hours because they had trained for months to do exactly that, who would build it under fire because they had enough materials to absorb losses, who would build it again if you destroyed it because behind them waited ships and factories and a political system that had mobilized resources on scales that European military tradition had no framework to comprehend. The sound of hammers on steel echoing across Norman rivers in the summer of 1944 was the sound of a new kind of warfare being born. Not more humane, not more just, but more total, more industrial, more comprehensive in its mobilization of national capacity. The Germans heard that sound and understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, the nature of the enemy they faced. Not supermen, not heroes, just workers, millions of them, backed by a system that could turn their labor into military power with an efficiency that made traditional warfare look almost artisanal by comparison. The bridges stand, in memory if not always in physical fact, as monuments to that transformation. They are not glorious monuments. They do not inspire poetry or paintings, but they are true monuments, honest ones, markers of the moment when warfare became fully modern, fully industrial, fully American in character. And they remind us, if we care to remember, that freedom's victory in that terrible war was built not just on bravery and sacrifice, but on Bailey bridges and supply chains, on factories and logistics, on the unglamorous work of building things faster than the enemy could destroy them. That, in the end, was the democratic way of war. Not more beautiful than the alternative, perhaps, but more sustainable, more patient, more certain. The sound of American hammers ringing out across the rivers of France never stopped. And that, as much as any battlefield heroism, is why those rivers were crossed and why the war was won.